Hi everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you to this very unusual 29th annual conference of the Tax Research Network. As most of you know, we originally expected to be meeting in Christ's College in Cambridge, but you will also understand the reasons why this has not proved possible. I have a very long list of thanks to everyone who has pulled together to make this conference happen in the very difficult circumstances. But at the very top of any list would have to be my co-organisers Kate Withers and Andy Limo from the University of Birmingham. They've dropped tools on already very busy schedules to explore and learn new techniques, or at the least to teach me about those new techniques. I couldn't be more grateful, and the conference wouldn't have happened without Kate's and Andy's efforts. I'm also very grateful for the continued support of our contributors, who've reacted to the change in circumstances with patience and enthusiasm, and who have submitted presentations that are interesting, intellectually robust, and often ingenious in approach as well as content. The programme is also extremely varied, with presentations ranging from tax history to quantitative analysis, international taxation, tax theory, digitisation, taxpayer rights and the tax profession, all the way through to the roundtable discussions of tax clinics and public tax education on Wednesday. We hope that you enjoy the presentations as much as we have when putting this conference together. On a practical matter, you will notice that the programme includes a mixture of pre-recorded talks and live discussion sessions. The latter are intended to be informal and friendly, and we hope that as many of you as possible will be able to come along and support the speakers for their slots. Instructions on how to access these discussions are available on the same sheet that helped you to access this talk and should be self-explanatory. Before I pass over to Andy, I'd like to thank a few other individuals who've put a great deal of effort into the TRN over recent months. Linda Birkinshaw has been tireless as our finance person, and together with Andy, Pete Miller and myself has gone about the onerous task of regularising the organisation's legal structure. Anne Fairpo has exercised one of her enormous collection of specialisms by keeping our website in good order, and the steering committee have had to deal with several times the normal expected email traffic. Sue O'Donnell and Kevin Kean at Christ's College also put significant amounts of work into this conference before it had to be moved online. We are very grateful for all of your help. For those of you who are just watching and enjoying the conference, I hope that you enjoy it. This is obviously our first time running a conference in this way, so we'd be very grateful for any positive or constructive feedback. Just send it to the usual conference email address, trn2020cambridge@trn.org.uk. That's trn2020cambridge@trn.org.uk. Now over to Andy.
As the current chair of the Tax Research Network, I'd like to add my welcome to Dominic's to you all to our Tax Research Network 2020 annual conference. This year's event, like so many others, is completely different to the way we had originally planned this when we began to put together what we thought would be a great event at the University of Cambridge this year. While we're not able to get together face to face this year, for all the obvious reasons, we really hope that you will enjoy what the conference organisers have been able to put together for us over the next 3 days. There are almost 50 different events, both pre-recorded and live, that people have offered as part of this year's event. I'd like to offer my thanks to various people that have worked together to be able to make this event happen this year. Firstly, to our event sponsors, the ICAEW charitable funds, who have generously given us again funds to be able to pay for the bringing together of this event in the way that we have done this year. We're hugely grateful for their ongoing support to the Tax Research Network. Obviously, I'd also like to offer my thanks to Dominic as the key organiser of this event. He expected it to be in Cambridge, where he'd be able to show off the fabulous colleges of the city of Cambridge to us, and maybe we'll be able to visit him again on another occasion. But he has worked tirelessly with our conference organiser, Kate Withers, who's based at the University of Birmingham with me, to pull together what I think is going to be a fantastic event. And I really hope you will make the most of what's on offer over the next few days. Of course, the event doesn't happen without people to participate in it. So I'd really like to thank our keynote speakers who have gone above and beyond what normally would be expected of them to not only prepare presentations, but also to take on the responsibility of recording them on our behalf and sending them to us so that we could package them up so that you can look at them, watch them, and then participate in live discussions with each of our keynote speakers, all of whom have kindly agreed to be present at our event live, online, after their scheduled presentations. We thank them greatly for their willingness to do that. Of course, the event itself, however, wouldn't have happened without all of our speakers and with all of you who are attending as delegates to this event. So I thank you both as well. I'd also like to thank the steering group members of the Tax Research Network who have agreed to chair each of the live sessions and to ensure that they flow as smoothly as the technology will allow to enable us to get as much as possible from the interactions over the next 3 days. During the scheduled presentations of both of our keynote speakers and of our various speakers during the next 3 days, please feel free to add comments in the usual way to the YouTube clips. These will be available to our keynotes and to our speakers, who I know will appreciate any feedback, questions, or discussion that you would like to offer to them. Perhaps you're not going to be able to participate in the live sessions. Your time zone may not allow that. Unfortunately, there is a limit to what we can do to manage things across multiple time zones. But this will give you a mechanism to be able to provide some feedback to the speakers who I know would appreciate it. So I commend the conference to you. Thank you for being willing to participate, and I really hope that you will enjoy this event. And I look forward to seeing what will come up over the next 3 days as we all participate in the Tax Research Network 2020. I'll hand back now to Dominic to introduce our first keynote speaker to commence the conference today. Thank you, Dominic.
Thank you, Andy. I'm delighted to introduce our first keynote speaker. Now, the first thing that comes to mind when I think of this individual is the ICAEW's intellectual heavyweight. I was perhaps a little hesitant to say this out loud, in case it offends the Institute's other intellectual heavyweights. But the description really does fit, so let's stick with it. I'm talking, of course, about Anita Monteith, former chairman of the ICAEW tax faculty, and currently a senior technical manager responsible for tax policy. Anita is probably best known to the general public as a regular on the Radio 4 programme Moneybox, and more broadly as one of the go-to experts when the print and broadcast media are looking for informed commentary on tax. Of course, this rests on a great deal of behind-the-scenes experience, and amongst many other activities, Anita has served as a special advisor to the Treasury Select Committee and as a secondee to the House of Lords Select Committee on Personal Service Companies. Anita has particular interests in the taxation of work and in digitalisation, and has recently been involved in Making Tax Digital, as well as recent developments in off-payroll working and the IR35 regimes. Most recently, she has been working on the COVID schemes, such as the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme and the Self-Employed Income Support Scheme. As you can imagine, her knowledge is very much in demand at the moment, and we are very fortunate that she has agreed to speak to us today. I do hope that you enjoy her video, and please do remember to log into the live discussion afterwards, the details of which are on your conference schedule. Welcome, Anita.
Hello, my name's Anita Monteith and I work for the ICAEW tax faculty. Thank you very much for inviting me to address your conference today, especially through this new online medium. I've been working with governments, HMRC and Treasury for about 25 years, focusing increasingly on tax policy development and how it comes about. Believe it or not, we do have some good policy measures, but we do also have some really quite bad ones. And sometimes it's the actual policy itself which is bad for a variety of reasons. And sometimes it's just because the design process went wrong. A recent example of a particularly bad policy was the IHT main residence relief nil rate ban, which I think after political interference has turned into an absolute monster, which means that it's impossible for the average layman to understand. But I thought I'd start by talking about how the policy setting process is meant to work. It is, of course, the job of the government of the day to decide fiscal policy, usually staying broadly in line with its election manifesto. I say broadly because unexpected events, such as a global pandemic, might make change necessary. For example, an election manifesto pledge not to raise taxes might be one that we could understand a government moving away from if it needs to plug a giant hole in the nation's finances. I guess we'll have to wait and see about that. But it is, of course, the job of the government. Now, the general idea is that policy follows the budget cycle. So new policies will be announced in the annual budget, then we get consultation on the detail. And at that point, people like ICAEW, the CIOT, any other interested party would make representations. Hopefully, those will be taken on board, and the next stage would be perhaps draft legislation, more consultation, and draft guidance. And one of the criticisms we often make is that because we see the draft legislation and draft guidance separately, it's very difficult to comment on an holistic package. And that actually doesn't make for a great process. And we're having real problems at the moment, for instance, with the legislation for off-payroll working in the private sector, where that arrived piecemeal. But that, I dare say, will be something that we'll continue to work on. But what we've seen in recent years is the cycle speeding up. And part of that has, as a result, meant we're relying on secondary legislation more and more to plug the gaps, and of course HMRC's guidance. So, for example, during the development of MTD for VAT, most of the detailed rules are in the regulations and the VAT notices, which are actually really clunky when you look at them. Although they make an easy read, it's the bits in the boxes in the VAT notices which are law, and the rest of it just explanation. Unfortunately, this secondary legislation and these VAT notices don't get nearly the same level of parliamentary scrutiny. I do wonder sometimes why we get quite so excited about parliamentary scrutiny, though, given that there aren't that many tax specialists in Parliament. And so you do wonder exactly whether the people who are making the legislation understand the words of what they're putting through. Now, unfortunately, one of the big challenges we have is time. The speed with which legislation gets passed never really allows enough time for adequate consultation. And that's why I'm a big fan of roadmaps. We've asked for these many times, and in July, on gov.uk, the paper Building a Trusted Modern Tax Administration was published. And what that gives us is a roadmap for tax administration and the changes that the government would like to make, together with making tax digital. That's where it's all set out for us for the next 3 to 4 years, really. So we have now got them at roadmap that we've asked for. Now, what will be required here is that businesses that are registered voluntarily for VAT have until April 2022 to make sure their record keeping will comply with the MTD for VAT regulations, and then they will need to transition. So then all VAT registered businesses, with a few exceptions, will be in the MTD club. But we also know that income tax will move to quarterly reporting in 2023. And I think knowing that policy in advance is helpful whether you agree with it or not. Now, with respect to MTD for income tax and VAT, one obvious challenge is going to be that unless you have quarterly reporting to the same dates, it's going to be an extra admin burden on the business, and you could end up with doing more reconciliations. Now, one of the policy proposals that we are considering at ICAEW is whether we should press for the government to change the end of the tax year. And that's something that gets discussed. It comes around regularly every 10 years or so. And in the past, we've always been told that it's just too difficult to do that. However, I think we're in crisis times, and maybe this is where we can see some really big changes happen. And I think if MTD for income tax is to be truly successful and achievable, bringing the end of the tax year to the 31st of March is something we should really consider quite seriously. Now, who else within government has a lot to say on policy? Well, there are a lot of committees in government, and of these, I think I put the Treasury Select Committee top of my list of influential groups of MPs. And it does actually hold the government and take the Chancellor in particular to task quite frequently. The chairman is always from the party in power. So at the moment, of course, that's the Conservatives, although the party itself is made up of a broad cross-section from all the parties. The current chairman is Mel Stride, which is also particularly relevant because Mel used to be the Financial Secretary to the Treasury, and that's the post that's now held by Jessie Norman. So Mel himself used to be the minister with responsible for tax design, and he had quite a big hand in making tax digital when it was first introduced for VAT. Now, I think that means that we can expect to see the Treasury Select Committee being quite interested in any tax measures being brought forward by the new government. As it happens, I was actually seconded to the Treasury Select Committee back in 2011, and the job I was asked to do then was to help them come up with some principles for measuring good new tax policy. In fact, mostly what we came up with after the end of that particular work was that you couldn't really beat Adam Smith's principles of fairness, certainty, convenience and efficiency. However, in spite of that, I stayed with them as a special advisor for the next 6 years, which was hugely interesting under Andrew Tyree as its chairman, and it gave me a lot of experience in design and policy making. Now, I think the Tax After COVID inquiry is the Treasury Select Committee inquiry that we should all be responding to. It's not only income tax and MTD that they'll be looking at, but of course it's the whole future of things like the taxation of work, online purchasing versus purchasing in the high street. Intergenerational fairness will be another topic. And those are just some of the themes that they're going to be dealing with. But moving to a more digital tax system, I keep coming back to that. I think that's got to be the central plank. Now, not all tax policies get stopped on their way, not all bad tax policies get stopped on their way to the statute book. Some really bad ones do manage to squeak their way through despite being challenged by the committee on the way. For me, I think the one I hate most was the high income child benefit charge. Now, in fact, that one came in exactly the same budget as the one that brought in VAT on warm takeaway food. You may remember the furore we had over the pasty tax at the time. What was actually meant to have happened during that particular interrogation by the Treasury Select Committee was that the Chancellor, George Osborne at the time, should have had a selection of questions that the committee had already decided over a variety of new policy measures being introduced. But what actually happened was that one particular member of the committee got the pasty tax between the teeth, and that took up a huge amount of time, which meant that the high income child benefit charge didn't get nearly the amount of airtime that it should have had, and the press had an absolute field day. The pasty tax did actually get overturned, but unfortunately the high income child benefit charge did not, and we've still got that now. So which other government committees are generally heard on tax? Well, the Public Accounts Committee is one, whose inquiries do tend to get a voice in the media and are held in fairly high regard. But there are also literally hundreds of all-party political groups, APPGs, and I'm a member of one, the APPG on tax. Then another that we should not forget is the House of Lords, which although don't really get involved in financial bills, they do always have a finance bill subcommittee, and that can generally create waves. And one of the inquiries they had earlier this year was on the implementation cost of MTD for VAT, and that came up with some fairly big numbers and a very stinging report as a consequence. But at the end of the day, it comes back to the government of the day. That is the Chancellor of the Exchequer and people close to him, where we see policy coming from. Now, what about outside of government? Who else is particularly influential? Well, I think the Office of Tax Simplification. The OTS is actually housed physically inside the Treasury, and although it is funded by the government, it is largely independent. It does do some inquiry work itself and can shine a spotlight on new areas which need a closer look for tax strategy purposes. For example, they did a very good paper on the gig economy a couple of years ago. And small business tax is a focus that just keeps coming around again. I think everybody would agree that the way small businesses are taxed, where we have income tax and of course national insurance for a sole trader, where we have a personal service company that may be being used for somebody doing similar work, or we have someone who could do the same work but be treated as an employee, it doesn't really make sense to the person who knows nothing about tax that for doing the same work you pay a different amount and you're entitled to different benefits. I think we can expect the OTS to be coming back to that in a future inquiry. Their current call for evidence, though, is on capital gains tax, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if we didn't see some tax changes there, perhaps next year. Of course, by getting the OTS to make these suggestions, that can take some of the sting out of the political debate. So we have the Treasury Select Committee, we have the OTS as two big ones to watch, and then we have the HMRC and Treasury departments themselves that come to make tax policy. Well, do they have training in policy making? Well, yes, they do. And in fact, what happens is that because civil servants within HMRC and the Treasury get moved around pretty regularly, every 4 to 5 years into a different role, when they first move into tax policy making roles, they're put through a tax policy school. Hasn't always happened, it's just happened for the last 4 or 5 years. And I've been involved in that pretty much all of the sessions. They happen every 6 months. I'm not sure how they'll do it. Now we're all working remotely, but I hope I can still help out with those however they make it work in future. But what happens is that the 30 or so people in the tax policy school for that particular cohort would go away for a week in a sort of lockdown situation, and they will have during that week a whole series of lectures and visits from senior civil servants and also from government ministers. And in fact, the financial secretary himself, usually, could be herself, of course, will go along and talk to them about what he or she expects from policy making. During the week, they also have to come up with an idea for a tax policy challenge. And I think that's something that perhaps you could do with some of your students, perhaps in seminars. So let's just take an easy one and I'll describe what happens. The sugar tax. What happens is that the government decides that its policy is going to be to tackle obesity, and it's going to use the tax system to do that. And one of the issues, of course, is the amount of sugar in soft drinks. So the Financial Secretary to the Treasury asks his advisors and civil service team to come up with some suggestions for how they'll do that, and they have a brainstorm. They look at the options and consider the variables. So, for example, are you going to charge a tax or a levy on the many or the few? So is it going to be a levy on the manufacturer, perhaps on the sugar they've used in production? Or is it going to be a checkout tax, so 1 penny on the can of Coke or Sprite, etc., etc.? Now that sounds simple enough, but you get complications. What about Diet Coke? Are you going to tax that as well? What about drinks that were manufactured overseas, where the manufacturer isn't subject to UK tax? How would that work? What about natural sugars that you might find perhaps in pure orange juice? Will you tax those as well? How do you then calculate the cost of implementing the policy? That's always the really, really difficult bit, especially if you haven't got the OBR to give you a hand with the numbers. Will you need a new IT system? That's a big question these days, and if so, how much is that going to cost if you want to collect this new tax? And then, in the case of the sugar tax, are you allowed to deduct the potential savings that the NHS might get through the reduction in obesity levels? And so it goes on. Now that was a real life example and was one of perhaps, I think, the easiest that I've seen. And of course it is always going to be easier to tax the few rather than the many, which is why we see the sugar tax being applied on manufacturing. But not all of these policy-making schools end up leading to a new tax. They do have some pretty good ideas though. They had a go at devising a tourism tax. I did see something quite recently being mooted in Scotland, for example, but I don't think that's actually been legislated. They've had various attempts to tax digital purchasing. We've seen climate change taxes, and there were a lot of really interesting ways of tackling that one. But I think on the whole, tax policy making is more difficult than we think. And a big challenge is always going to be, what is it actually for? Is it to change behaviour? Is one of the big questions they're always faced with. If it is to change behaviour and it works, then it's not going to be a revenue earner for very long. And a good example of that one was the plastic carrier bag tax. But just to finish up with, I wanted just to mention briefly my most recent challenge. And that was back in March when COVID pandemic first reached the UK. I reached out to Treasury offering to help just as the job retention and self-employment schemes were being designed. And together then with a small group of other professionals, we worked pretty much round the clock. And certainly I remember working all through Easter and Maybank holidays to help with the principles. There were various principles that had to be borne in mind. For example, easing pressure on the NHS. So that meant people would need to stay at home. It meant they couldn't go to work. And if they couldn't work from home, they could lose their jobs because employers wouldn't have any income, wouldn't be able to pay wages. Hence the need for the furlough scheme. It sounds very, very simple, but of course it isn't. And one of the key challenges is always going to be people who will try to manipulate the system for themselves. And that was why the government looked to the real-time information system, that's the payroll digital data they get on a month-by-month basis, to support the validity of the furlough scheme payments. Same with the self-employment scheme. But of course there the problem is that their data was out of date. The most recent tax returns they had were the 2019 ones. And that meant that people with very new businesses weren't going to qualify for relief. That's why we are back to looking at making tax digital. And that's why I think real-time information from businesses is something, it's the sort of golden prize that government and HMRC is looking for. So I do think it's going to be very, very important to engage with that discussion over the next couple of years. But for me, simplifying the underlying rules of income tax have got to be what comes first. We shall see. Thank you very much for listening to me.